Clint Eastwood crushes liberal journalist who mocked his career. A clapback that shook the audience. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The Dolby Theater gleamed under the brilliance of thousands of lights, each one reflecting off the polished gold statuettes that symbolize the pinnacle of cinematic achievement. The grand venue, with its velvet-lined walls and sweeping balconies, had witnessed countless historic moments in film history, and tonight would be no different. Outside, the red carpet buzzed with the energy of Hollywood's elite. A-list actors, acclaimed directors, and industry power players, each vying for the fleeting immortality that came with an Academy Award. Ryan Blake, seated in the press box high above the main floor, adjusted his tie with the ease of someone who had been in this position many times before. Despite his young age, he had already carved a name for himself as a sharp-tongued, no-holds-barred entertainment journalist. His online columns and social media presence had skyrocketed in popularity, largely due to his unapologetic takes on Hollywood's biggest stars. While most journalists walked the fine line between critique and diplomacy, Ryan bulldozed right through it, favoring brutal honesty and biting humor over respect and reverence. Tonight, he was primed for another viral moment. With his earpiece connected to the live broadcast feed, he listened as hosts on the main stage guided the audience through the night's prestigious categories: Best Supporting Actor, Best Director, Best Picture. He offered occasional commentary, quick quips that he knew would trend on Twitter, but he was waiting for one particular moment. As the ceremony neared its final stretch, the evening's host, a charismatic comedian, stepped forward with a wide grin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for a very special honor. A man who has defined American cinema for decades. A legend, a master of the craft. Tonight we celebrate the one and only Clint Eastwood. The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet before Eastwood even appeared. The camera panned to the aging icon seated near the front, his expression calm and composed. Even in his 90s, he carried an unmistakable presence, the same quiet intensity that had defined his career. Ryan leaned forward, his smirk growing. This was it. This was his moment. As Eastwood stood and approached the stage, the applause only grew louder. Decades of westerns, crime dramas, and unforgettable performances had cemented his status as one of Hollywood's most enduring figures. Some saw him as a relic, a throwback to an era that had long since passed, but others viewed him as a titan, a man whose very name carried the weight of cinematic history. Ryan, however, saw an opportunity. The co-host sitting beside him, an older journalist with a far more diplomatic approach, glanced at him warily. "Ryan, maybe don't," but it was too late. Ryan's voice came through the live broadcast, dripping with calculated sarcasm. "Here we go, folks," he said smoothly, his voice cutting through the reverence like a blade. "Hollywood's about to give Clint Eastwood a Lifetime Achievement Award because nothing screams cutting-edge cinema like another tribute to a guy who peaked in the 1970s. A ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. It was subtle but palpable, a few nervous laughs from those who weren't sure whether to agree or recoil. Others merely shifted in their seats, glancing around to gauge the room's reaction. Ryan, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "I mean, let's be honest," he continued, his smirk widening. "How many times can a man squint at the camera and mumble before we start calling it a gimmick? The guy's been playing the same cowboy since Nixon was in office." This time there were no laughs, just silence, a heavy, expectant silence, and then movement. Clint Eastwood, standing at the microphone, had clearly heard every word. He adjusted the mic slightly, his rugged face betraying no emotion. The entire theater seemed to hold its breath. Ryan Blake could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, even though he was sitting safely in the press box above the crowd. The room had shifted. The air, once filled with celebratory excitement, was now thick with something else, something more potent. Discomfort, expectation, and a collective question that buzzed just beneath the surface. Did he really just say that? The older journalist beside him, Mike Harland, let out a quiet sigh and rubbed his temples. He had seen Ryan pull stunts before. His entire career was built on pushing the line. But this time it felt different. "Kid," Mike muttered under his breath, careful to keep his voice out of the live broadcast. "You might want to start drafting your apology now." Ryan barely acknowledged him, still fixated on the stage. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he was thrilled. Moments like this were what made careers. His entire philosophy on entertainment journalism revolved around challenging the status quo, shaking up the old guard, and refusing to worship Hollywood's untouchable legends just because they had been around forever. And Clint Eastwood? He was the epitome of that old guard. Ryan had never understood the blind reverence for the man. Sure, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was a classic, but did that really mean Eastwood deserved to be put on a pedestal for eternity? Hollywood, in Ryan's eyes, had spent too long celebrating the past instead of looking to the future. His comments were just an attempt to voice what younger audiences were already thinking. But as he watched Clint Eastwood adjust the microphone with steady hands, Ryan realized something. The room wasn't just waiting for Eastwood to speak. They were waiting for him to respond. The silence stretched thick and expectant. Then Eastwood leaned slightly toward the microphone, his posture as relaxed as ever, as if he were about to give a speech like any other. But his eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to be looking straight through Ryan, even from across the vast expanse of the Dolby Theater. "You know," Eastwood said, his gravelly voice filling the room, "there's an old saying, if a man talks long enough, eventually he'll say something stupid." The reaction was immediate. The audience, caught between stunned disbelief and sheer amusement, erupted into laughter. Some clapped. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the event host, standing to the side of the stage, stifled a grin as he took a half-step backward, as if clearing space for the aftermath of what had just been unleashed. Ryan felt his face flush, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. He wasn't going to let some rehearsed old man wisdom shake him. But then Eastwood wasn't finished. Ryan blinked. Eastwood was about to speak. The legendary actor, still impossibly composed, let the laughter settle before continuing. "I figure in a business where everyone's desperate to stay relevant, it must be tough realizing that some things never go out of style." This time the claw came harder, louder. It wasn't just laughter now, it was approval. Eastwood had spoken, and Hollywood had made its choice. Ryan opened his mouth, scrambling for a comeback. He had to recover, had to take control of the moment before it completely ran away from him. His brain raced through possible responses. He could lean into the joke, make it seem like he had expected this reaction all along. Maybe he could double down, turn the moment into a real debate about outdated filmmaking. But it was too late because Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent decades mastering the art of delivering a perfect final line, was already turning away from the microphone. He gave a small nod to the host, as if to signal that he was done, then walked off the stage with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had never needed to rush. The moment stretched in time, Eastwood's departure punctuated only by the roar of the audience still echoing in the background. Ryan sat frozen, his hands clenched beneath the table. He could hear his producer talking in his earpiece, could see the studio cameras still on him, capturing his every reaction, waiting for his next move. But he had none. For the first time in his career, Ryan Blake had been left completely, undeniably speechless. The theater buzzed with an energy that only moments of true, unscripted magic could generate. Hollywood was a town built on spectacle, on carefully curated performances. But what had just happened was raw, authentic, a moment destined to be replayed, dissected, and turned into legend. Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent his life embodying quiet strength on screen, had just delivered one of the most memorable one-liners in awards show history. And the best part? It had required no theatrics, no grand gestures. Just a calm voice, a simple truth, and a slow, deliberate exit. The crowd was still reacting, applause fading into murmurs of disbelief and amusement when Ryan Blake finally found his voice again. Or at least he tried to. Ryan, he stammered, leaning toward his microphone. His usually smooth, practiced delivery faltered, the confidence behind it rattled. Well, looks like, he swallowed hard, forcing a smirk. Looks like Clint still knows how to deliver a line. Huh? But it was weak, transparent, even. Ryan could hear the strain in his voice. The crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore. His co-host, Mike Harland, exhaled through his nose. One of those sharp, knowing breaths that spoke louder than words. Mike had been in this business for decades, and he knew what Ryan was just now realizing. This wasn't something he could joke his way out of. The cameras were still on him, still broadcasting his every micro-expression to the millions watching at home. His social media mentions were probably already on fire. He could feel it, the shift, the loss of control. It was a sensation he had never truly experienced before. For years, Ryan had been the one orchestrating these viral moments. He was the guy who poked the bear, who stirred up controversy and thrived on the backlash. He had built an entire career on saying what others wouldn't, on calling out the old guard and positioning himself as the voice of the new generation. But now he wasn't the provocateur, he was the punchline. And the worst part? He wasn't even sure he had been wrong about Eastwood's movies. But none of that mattered now because the reality was that in Hollywood, perception was everything. And right now, the perception was that Clint Eastwood had put him in his place. And that, more than any critique, more than any argument, was what would define him. Unless he found a way to change the narrative. Ryan knew what he had to do. He had to face Clint Eastwood. The walls of Ryan Blake's apartment felt like they were closing in. His once cozy Los Angeles loft, decorated with framed magazine covers of his best articles, awards for his cutting-edge journalism, and a bookshelf stacked with entertainment history, now felt like a self-made shrine to a man on the verge of irrelevance. He had been trending for 3 days straight, and not in the way he wanted. Social media had turned his embarrassment into a full-scale cultural event. TikTok was flooded with reaction videos, each one dissecting his humiliation in painstaking detail. YouTube had montages, remixes, and analysis pieces titled things like "The Exact Moment Ryan Blake's Career Ended," "How to Handle a Roast," "A Lesson from Clint Eastwood," and "Why You Should Never Underestimate a Legend." Ryan had spent years crafting his persona as Hollywood's most fearless critic, the one willing to say what others wouldn't. But now, he was the one being critiqued, and the reviews weren't kind. His phone vibrated for the 10th time that morning. He glanced at the screen, his editor, Carla Reynolds. No avoiding it now. He sighed and answered, "Carla, Ryan." Her voice was clipped, professional. "I'm going to get straight to it. This is bad." "No kidding," he replied. "You need to fix this," she continued. "Your credibility is tanking right now. You're not the guy with sharp insights. You're the guy who got publicly schooled by a 90-something-year-old legend. And worse, you didn't even fight back." Ryan rubbed his temples. "What do you want me to do? Trash him? That'll just make me look bitter." Carla hesitated. "Not necessarily, but you need to do something right now. You're letting the internet tell your story, and they're painting you as the cocky kid who got humbled. If you don't push back, that's going to stick." Ryan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Carla was right. The story had already taken on a life of its own. If he didn't regain control, he would be known as the guy Clint Eastwood had casually dismantled on live TV. Forever. He needed a strategy. What if I do a sit-down interview? Ryan suggested. Address it head-on, own it. But also make my case about Hollywood's obsession with nostalgia. Carla sighed. You could try, but here's the problem. Nobody cares about your case right now. They care about the moment, and any attempt to downplay it is just going to make you look defensive. No, what you need is a comeback. A real one. Ryan frowned. Like what? A pause. Then Carla's voice, careful, calculating. Talk to him. Ryan blinked. Excuse me? Talk to Clint Eastwood, she repeated. You keep acting like this is a war. But what if it wasn't? What if instead of trying to counterpunch, you flipped the script and turned this into an opportunity? Ryan scoffed. You think he's just going to sit down and chat with me after what I said? Maybe, Carla mused. Or maybe he'll tell you to go to hell. But either way, people will respect you for facing him. Right now, the world sees you as a kid who ran his mouth and got shut down. If you show up, own it, and hell, learn something from him, that changes the story. Suddenly, you're not the punchline. You're the guy who took a hit, stood back up, and had the guts to look the legend in the eye. Ryan exhaled, rubbing his face. And if he refuses? Then you move on, she said simply. But at least you'll have tried. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. It was a risky move, but Carla had a point. If he didn't take action, the internet was going to define him forever. There was just one problem. Even if I wanted to do this, Ryan said slowly, I have no way of getting to him. Another pause. Then Carla, her voice unreadable. Actually, you do. An hour later, Ryan sat staring at his email inbox, his hands hovering over the keyboard, hesitation gnawing at him. Carla had a connection, a producer who had worked with Eastwood in the past. She had sent Ryan the email address of one of Eastwood's longtime assistants. It wasn't a direct line to the man himself, but it was as close as he was going to get. Ryan took a deep breath and started typing. Subject: a conversation request. Dear Mr. Eastwood's team, my name is Ryan Blake, and I imagine you're already aware of who I am after recent events. I'll be blunt. I'd like to meet with Mr. Eastwood. Not for an interview, not for a PR stunt, just a conversation. I've spent years critiquing Hollywood's past, and he's spent decades defining it. I think I have something to learn from him, and maybe, just maybe, he'll have something to say to me in return. If he's open to it, I'm willing to meet on his terms, wherever he's comfortable. I understand that this request may be ignored, but I believe it's worth asking. Thank you for your time, Ryan Blake. He stared at the email for another full minute before finally clicking send. 2 days passed with no reply. Ryan tried to move on, focusing on other assignments, but his mind kept circling back to that email. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe Clint Eastwood saw him as nothing more than an arrogant kid who had already gotten what he deserved. And then an alert, new email. Ryan's pulse quickened as he opened it. Subject: a conversation request. Ryan, Mr. Eastwood has read your request. His response was short. Come find me in Carmel if you're man enough. Ryan's heart pounded. Clint Eastwood had answered, and now he had no choice but to face him. And then the waiting began. Ryan Blake stared at the email for a full minute before it truly sank in. Come find me in Carmel if you're man enough. It was so perfectly Eastwood. Succinct, no nonsense, carrying the weight of a challenge without a single wasted word. The email didn't specify a time or a place, just the name of Eastwood's longtime home, Carmel by the Sea. Ryan had two choices: ignore it and let the story fade along with his credibility, or go. He booked a flight that night. Carmel by the Sea was nothing like Los Angeles. The moment Ryan stepped off the plane in nearby Monterey, he could feel the shift. The air smelled of salt and pine instead of smog and ambition. The streets, lined with small shops and art galleries, had none of the frantic energy of Hollywood. It was quieter, slower, a place for people who had already proved themselves. For Clint Eastwood, it was home. Ryan checked into a modest motel near the ocean, then set out to find the man himself. But there was one problem. He had no idea where to look. Eastwood's team hadn't given an address or any further instructions. No handlers, no schedule, no prearranged sit-down, just an open-ended challenge. Ryan asked around, carefully testing the waters with shop owners and locals. He wasn't surprised to find that Eastwood's privacy was well protected. People here knew the legend, but they weren't about to sell him out to an outsider. It wasn't until he wandered into a small diner, a rustic place called the Mission Ranch, that he finally got his answer. The hostess, an older woman with sharp eyes, gave him a knowing look when he asked, "Does Clint Eastwood ever come in here?" "Depends," she said, not looking up from her notepad. "Who's asking?" "Ryan Blake," he said. She gave him a slow once-over, then smirked. "Figured you'd show up." His stomach twisted. "So, is he here?" She nodded toward a table in the corner. "Been waiting for you." Ryan turned, and there he was, Clint Eastwood, sitting alone, sipping black coffee. No entourage, no cameras. Just him, the quiet legend, watching the motion through the window like a man who had seen it all before. Ryan swallowed hard, squared his shoulders, and walked over. He stopped at the table, waiting. Eastwood didn't acknowledge him at first, just kept looking out at the waves. After a long beat, he finally spoke. "You stand there all day? Or are you going to sit?" Ryan slid into the seat across from him, suddenly aware of how young he felt up close. Clint Eastwood was every bit the figure he had always appeared to be. His face, weathered by time, still carrying that same steel confidence. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, held none of the warmth of a Hollywood star eager to make small talk. This wasn't an actor playing a part. This was him. A man who had mastered being Clint Eastwood. A waitress came by, setting down another coffee for Eastwood without asking. She barely glanced at Ryan before walking off. Clearly, Eastwood was a regular here. Ryan licked his lips, unsure how to start. He had prepared a dozen different ways to approach this meeting, but sitting here now, none of them felt right. Eastwood finally looked at him. His gaze, calm but heavy. "So," he said, voice gravelly as ever, "you survived the internet." Ryan let out a dry chuckle. "Barely." Eastwood nodded as if that answer was good enough. He took another sip of coffee, then set his mug down. "Tell me, what exactly were you trying to do up there?" Ryan hesitated, knowing this was the moment that would define everything. He could make excuses. He could say it was just a joke taken out of context. But he knew Eastwood wouldn't buy that, so he told the truth. "I thought I was making a point," Ryan admitted, "that Hollywood spends too much time looking back instead of forward, that we put too much stock in nostalgia." Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Ryan nodded. "Yeah, and maybe I thought I could make a name for myself by taking a shot at one of the legends to get a reaction." Just a flicker of something behind Eastwood's eyes, and Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. "And I got my ass handed to me." A small smirk tugged at the corner of Eastwood's mouth. "That you did." Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "So what now? You get to gloat?" Eastwood shrugged. "Ain't much to gloat about. You took a swing. You missed." He leaned back in his chair, studying Ryan. "Question is, what did you learn?" Ryan sat with that for a moment. He could have gone on the defensive. He could have argued that his point still stood. But as he looked at Eastwood, really looked at him, he realized something. He hadn't been challenging a career. He had been challenging longevity. And longevity wasn't something you could argue against. "I learned that some things stick around for a reason," Ryan admitted, "and that taking cheap shots doesn't make me right." Eastwood gave a slow nod. "That's something, D." Ryan exhaled. "So what now? You gonna tell me to quit while I'm ahead?" Eastwood chuckled, a deep raspy sound. "Kid, you're barely ahead." Ryan cracked a smile. "Fair." A comfortable silence settled between them, then Eastwood leaned forward slightly. Let me give you a little advice. Ryan straightened. Yeah. Eastwood's eyes locked onto his. You want to last in this business? Then learn when to shut up and listen. The words hit harder than Ryan expected. It wasn't an insult. It was a lesson. A hard, simple truth. Ryan nodded slowly. I hear you. Eastwood studied him for another long moment, then gave a small nod as if to say good. He picked up his coffee again, looking back out at the ocean. Ryan sat there for a while, letting the conversation settle in. He had come here looking for redemption, or at least a way to shift the narrative, but now he realized he had gotten something much more valuable. A lesson from a legend. And maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Ryan sat across from Clint Eastwood in the quiet diner, staring into his own untouched cup of coffee. The legendary actor had just given him a piece of advice that cut deeper than any public humiliation ever could. If you want to last in this business, learn when to shut up and listen. The words hung between them, unembellished but undeniable. For the first time in years, Ryan Blake didn't have a clever retort. Eastwood, ever composed, took another sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting out the window to the ocean beyond. He didn't seem in a hurry to elaborate. He had given Ryan the words, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with them. Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So that's it. That's my grand lesson? Eastwood smirked. What? You expect a 3-act structure? Ryan chuckled despite himself. I guess I'm just used to filling in the space, you know? Saying something when the silence gets too heavy. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's your problem, kid. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? The older man set down his coffee cup with a quiet clink. You talk like you've got it all figured out, like you're the authority on what's good, what's bad, what's relevant. But you ever stop to ask why some things last? Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it. Eastwood gave a small nod as if he had already known the answer. You look at guys like me and you see a relic. But let me tell you something. Being around a long time ain't about clinging to the past. It's about adapting, knowing when to evolve and when to hold your ground. You don't get to stay in this town for decades by being stubborn. You do it by knowing when to listen, when to change, and when to keep doing what you know works. Ryan swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed in a way he hadn't expected. I thought I was pushing for change. You were pushing for attention, Eastwood corrected. There's a difference. Ryan flinched. He wanted to argue, to say that his critiques weren't just for shock value, that he had meant what he said. But had he? Had he been challenging Hollywood's nostalgia, or had he just been taking cheap shots at an easy target? Eastwood studied him for a moment, then shook his head with a quiet chuckle. You remind me of a few people I used to know. Always had something to prove, always needed to be the loudest voice in the room. Ryan smirked weakly. Let me guess? They turned out to be massive failures. Eastwood shrugged. Some. Others learned when to shut up and let their work do the talking. He leaned in slightly. You still got time to figure out which one you want to be. Ryan swallowed hard. This wasn't just some casual conversation anymore. This was an ultimatum. For the first time, he considered what his career would look like if he didn't change. Sure, he had an audience now, but what about 5 years from now? 10? Would people still care about the hot takes of a guy who had been bested by a living legend? Or would he fade away, another commentator who burned too bright, too fast? The truth settled uncomfortably in his chest. He needed to rethink everything. Ryan sat there long after Eastwood had finished his coffee. The older man didn't rush him, didn't push him to fill the silence. He simply let him sit with his thoughts. Finally, Ryan broke the quiet. What would you do if you were me? Eastwood didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a couple of crumpled bills, and tossed them onto the table. Then he stood, stretching slightly. I wouldn't try to be anyone else. He adjusted his jacket, then gave Ryan one last look. I'd figure out what I actually stand for. With that, he gave a small nod and walked toward the door. Ryan watched him go, the weight of the moment settling in. He had come to Carmel expecting some kind of closure, a way to save face. Instead, he had been given something far more valuable. A choice. He could keep doing what he had been doing. Keep chasing headlines, keep tearing down legends in an effort to make himself seem bigger, or he could actually listen. He could figure out why Clint Eastwood was still standing while so many others had faded away. And then maybe he could start building something that would last. Ryan reached for his phone, staring at his reflection in the dark screen. He had a lot to think about, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a rush to say anything. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to listen. Ryan Blake sat alone at his hotel room's small desk, staring at a blank document on his laptop. The cursor blinked at him as if daring him to type something, anything, that could make sense of everything he had just experienced. His meeting with Clint Eastwood had been nothing like he had expected. He had walked into that diner thinking he needed to prove something, that he had to defend his position or somehow win the conversation. Instead, he had walked out realizing that he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Eastwood hadn't just humbled him, he had given him a roadmap. Whether he had intended to or not, figure out what you actually stand for. That was the part that lingered, the part that gnawed at him as he sat there, wrestling with his next move. He had spent his entire career making a name for himself by being sharp, by being loud, by positioning himself as the voice of a new generation of film criticism. But if he was being honest with himself, what had he actually built? Nothing. He had taken shots at others, but he had never created anything of his own. He had never told a story that would outlast a single news cycle. He had never contributed to something timeless. And then it hit him. Timeless. That was it. Ryan's fingers finally moved across the keyboard, the title of his new project appearing on the screen. Timeless. The Evolution of Hollywood Legends. 3 days later, Ryan was back in Los Angeles, standing in the sleek glass wall office of Carla Reynolds, his editor. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, studying him. So let me get this straight. You want to do a documentary about Hollywood legends? You. The guy who just tried to drag Clint Eastwood into irrelevance. Ryan exhaled. Yeah. She raised an eyebrow. And you think people are going to buy that? They will if I do it right, Ryan said, leaning forward. Look, I know how this sounds, but this isn't about backtracking or saving face. This is about me realizing that I've spent my whole career tearing people down instead of understanding why they lasted in the first place. Carla studied him for a long moment. So what's the angle? Ryan took a deep breath. We keep talking about how Hollywood is obsessed with nostalgia. And yeah, maybe it is, but there's a reason certain figures, Eastwood, Scorsese, Spielberg, keep standing the test of time. I want to explore why, not just their work, but their philosophy, their adaptability. What makes them different from the hundreds of other talented people who just disappeared? Carla tapped a finger against her desk, considering. I'm not interested in a puff piece, Ryan. If you're just trying to clean up your image, this won't work. Ryan shook his head. This isn't about that. This is about learning. I want to sit down with these people, filmmakers, actors, even the younger generation of directors, figure out what makes a Hollywood legacy actually stick. And more than that, I want to explore where we're going next, what today's young filmmakers are learning from these legends. Carla narrowed her eyes. And Clint. Ryan hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and slid it across the desk. On the screen was a text message. Clint Eastwood. Let me know if you need a good closing line. Carla stared at it. Then slowly a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. Well? She exhaled, shaking her head. You actually pulled it off. Ryan grinned. So you in? She sighed, rubbing her temples. I must be insane, but yeah, I'm in. 2 weeks later, Ryan was sitting in the warm, well-lit study of an industry legend. His first interview for Timeless. Across from him, sipping tea in a deep leather chair, was Martin Scorsese. The legendary director had agreed to be the first subject of Ryan's documentary, intrigued by the premise. Cameras were set up, sound engineers were in position, and Ryan had a set of carefully crafted questions in front of him. But as the cameras rolled, he found himself putting the questions aside. Instead, he asked, You've been making films for over 50 years. What's the one thing that's never changed? Scorsese's eyes lit up, and a slow smile crossed his face. The story, he said simply. The industry changes, the technology changes, but people will always need a story worth telling. Ryan nodded, absorbing the words. It was exactly what Clint had been saying in his own way. For the first time in his career, Ryan wasn't looking for the hottest take. He wasn't trying to score points. He was just listening. And for the first time, he realized this might be the best story he had ever told. The cameras were rolling, the soft hum of equipment filling the air as Ryan Blake sat across from Martin Scorsese in a warm wood-paneled study. The legendary director sipped his tea, thoughtful yet relaxed. This wasn't a press junket. It wasn't a promotional interview. It was a conversation. One Ryan never would have thought he'd be having a month ago. The story, Scorsese had just said, the industry changes, the technology changes, but people will always need a story worth telling. Ryan let the words settle. He glanced at his notes, carefully prepared questions about legacy, influence, and the future of film, but something inside him told him to abandon them. This wasn't about hitting bullet points. It was about understanding something deeper. So Ryan said, setting his notepad aside, "How do you know when a story is worth telling?" Scorsese smiled. "That's the hard part, isn't it?" He leaned forward slightly. "You have to feel it. It has to mean something to you. Every film I've ever made, every scene, every cut, it's all come from a place of personal connection. I'm not making movies for a trend. I'm making them because I have to, because there's something inside me that won't let me do anything else." Ryan nodded slowly. This was exactly what Clint Eastwood had been talking about. Passion, longevity, the ability to create something because you believe in it, not because it's what people expect. Scorsese continued, gesturing with his hands. The mistake a lot of young filmmakers make today is chasing relevance instead of truth. Relevance fades. Truth doesn't. Ryan felt that in his chest. For years, he had built his career on being relevant, on saying what people wanted to hear in the moment, on being the sharpest voice in the room. But had he ever actually sought truth? Had he ever dug deep enough to understand what made something last? That's what Timeless was about. Not just the legends, but the lessons they had learned. And for the first time, Ryan wasn't approaching a project as a critic. He was approaching it as a student. After the Scorsese interview, things started to fall into place. Word spread fast in Hollywood. Some people were skeptical. Was this just a stunt, a redemption arc? But others saw something genuine in Ryan's approach. Slowly, doors that had once been slammed shut began to crack open. Steven Spielberg agreed to a sit-down, intrigued by the idea of exploring the evolution of storytelling over decades. Meryl Streep signed on to discuss how actors adapted to changing times without losing their artistry. Even rising stars, young filmmakers and actors just breaking into the industry, wanted to be part of the conversation. And through it all, Ryan was learning, not just about Hollywood's past, but about its future, about what it took to build something lasting, something real. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very industry he had once mocked for being stuck in the past was now teaching him how to move forward. After months of interviews, research, and production, Timeless was shaping up to be more than just a documentary. It was becoming a movement, a conversation Hollywood didn't realize it needed. And then came the biggest moment yet. Ryan was sitting in a meeting with his producer when his phone buzzed. An email. The subject line was simple: Eastwood. His heart pounded as he opened it. "Tell me when the premiere is. I might have a seat open." Ryan exhaled sharply, a wave of relief and nerves washing over him. Clint Eastwood was watching. The last interview for Timeless had to be with Clint. It wasn't even a question. Ryan flew back to Carmel, this time without hesitation. When he arrived at the same diner where they had first met, Eastwood was already there, sipping black coffee like before. Ryan sat down, pulling out his notes, but Eastwood just smirked. "Put that away." Ryan hesitated, then set them aside. "You already know what you need to ask," Eastwood said. Ryan thought for a moment, then nodded. He looked Eastwood in the eye and asked the only question that mattered. "How did you really know you'd last?" Eastwood took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the mug down. "I didn't," he admitted, "not at first, hell, not even halfway through. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let anyone else decide when I was done." He leaned forward. "That's the secret, kid. You don't wait for permission to keep going. You just keep going." Ryan swallowed, letting the weight of the words sink in. This wasn't just about movies. It wasn't just about Hollywood. It was about legacy. And this time Ryan knew exactly what he wanted to build.